So what is Japanese Lovecraftian horror? Is that even a thing? J-Love horror? J-Craft? What happens when the mind-bending, tentacled-filled horrors of cosmicism combine with a singular and fascinating culture that is of the Japanese? Is this the result?
Holy Jesus! What is that? What the fuck is that? What is that?
Japan is my favorite nation. I was even able to visit it once in 2013. Fucking amazing. There is just something so awesome about that place that I cannot help but really respect. Maybe it's how they are so modern yet haven't lost touch with their culture and traditions, which makes them unique, something I think we lack here in the West. There's really no place like it. And as my favorite YouTuber puts it,
the Japanese make some crazy shit, but what can you expect? They've lived isolated on an island for like, what, thousands of years? Your brain's bound to make up some weird stuff.
I love their bizarre sense of humor, amazing food, their alcohol, the sound of the language, the assortment of writers they have, especially Ryu Murakami, their artistic endeavors like haiku poetry, films from the likes of Takeshi Kitano, and as an avid gamer growing up in the 90s, pretty much anything from Nintendo or Konami gave me a hard on. And of course, their horror. My god, J-horror is amazing. If Lovecraftian horror was my wife, J-horror would be the evil temptress tempting me to cheat. Japan produces some of the finest horror you can find, but always in a distinctive style that's quite different from here in the West. So I got to thinking, what would they do with Lovecraft's work? How would they interpret him and develop their own brand of Lovecraftian horror? Surely Japan would find a way to spin their own aesthetic and worldview into his brand of brilliant horror. And, as I suspected, there was a treasure trove of cosmic horror and a fair amount of what the fuck to be found. So let's take a look at Japanese Lovecraftian horror. Lovecraft's stories began appearing in Japanese print media a lot earlier than I thought, starting in the 1940s if you can believe it. I mean, that was when Japan was still at war and still had an empire. His works appeared in the Japanese equivalent of pulp magazines such as Hakaba, Bungai, Pearl, and Jewel, to name a few. One of the first stories was a translation of The Statement of Randolph Carter by Nishio Tadashi, and that proved quite successful. Furthermore, a weird fiction and mystery writer named Edogawa Rampo, who has huge respect as a writer in Japan, drew up a list of vital Western weird tales writers that Japanese readers should consider, and of course Lovecraft was on there. As a result of this endorsement, in the late 40s, more and more of Lovecraft's tales began getting translated, but still at a very slow rate. Japan is, of course, well known for its manga, so logically, adaptations began to pop up. The best and earliest example I can give of this is the manga Chitai no Ashioto from the 1960s, which is an adaptation of the Dunwich Horror by Shigeru Mizuki, another really respected name in Japan. He made some changes, of course, specifically localizing the story by setting it in Japan and giving the characters Japanese names and so on, but leaving the tale as Lovecraft intended. Despite this other big name endorsing Lovecraft, don't think that he was some sort of major hit in Japan during this time. At most, at this point, he was just like a foreign curiosity, though the few iterations of his works were met with general respect from the audience. In 1956, the first Japanese-made original Mythos tale was released, called The God of the Cult, created by Takaki Akimitsu. For the life of me, I tried to find an English copy or more information on the story, but the best I could do was this Japanese Amazon page. Nonetheless, it's worth noting that this point marks Japan's own beginning for original Mythos writing. From this point on until the 70s, more Western Mythos tales, including those from other Western Mythos writers like August Derleth, began entering the Japanese market, but always in secluded and very niche magazines only. In the 80s and 90s, things really picked up for the Mythos in Japan, thanks to the growing video game and role-playing games market in Japan. If you know anything about gaming from this era, you'll know how big fantasy was. Japan was really impressed with Western fantasy games like Dungeons & Dragons, Ultima, and Wizardry. There was big demand for that stuff, both as computer games and as tabletop RPG games. Can you guess now how Lovecraft became much more known there? Yeah, Call of Cthulhu RPG from Chaosium entered Japanese markets in 1986. It was a great hit because it was so original and fresh. As fun as games like D&D, Ultima, and the pioneer Japanese game Sword World RPG are, they're all typical Tolkien-style fantasy. Wizards, swords, goblins, dragons, and so on. The Call of Cthulhu RPG, as you probably know, is not about that at all. You don't roll the dice to kill Cthulhu, goddammit. This is the real shit, with real monsters, mind-bending difficulty, and horror instead of the Skyrim-type epic fantasy. Smaug looks like a little bitch next to even the most flamboyant of Shoggoths. Basically, video game creators, manga, and anime artists of that era were exposed to the mind-bending horrors and tentacled abominations of the mythos and began to include various elements into their own works. But these inclusions, as you will see later on in this video, were more often than not done for other purposes than that of creating cosmic horror. As these inclusions began to increase more and more, it created more interest in Lovecraft and allowed for Japanese mythos writers to get their own works more published. So basically that's the history of how Lovecraft began to influence Japan. But that's all very academic and boring, right? I'm sure you'd rather see actual examples of modern day depictions of and references to Lovecraft's creations, right? Okay, let's do that then. First off, let's start with some actual writers who did the best in adding to the mythos. I will give you 3 writers to look at. The first guy is Ken Asamatsu. From everything I've read about this guy, it seems that he is the biggest name in Japanese mythos. According to the short biography in this book, it states that he discovered Lovecraft at age 14 and got hooked on it, and has gone on to become a writer himself. Asamatsu states about Lovecraft, "I felt Lovecraft would be my mentor and guide in literature for the rest of my life." Asamatsu also steered his career towards literature in no small part because of Lovecraft, having been the one to get a Japanese fanzine focused on weird tales going, including making translations of Lovecraft's tales which were not readily available in Japanese yet. Later in life he joined a publishing house in order to create an anthology of original Japanese written mythos fiction. It didn't do too well initially, but afterwards he joined with Kurodahan Press. That resulted in this collection of books you see now, which not only include original Japanese written mythos stories, but essays filled with useful information about Japan and Lovecraft. It's because of him that we non-Japanese speakers have some mythos literature readily available to us. Let's face it, from a financial point of view, there isn't a great demand for Japanese mythos. Only weirdos like myself and you people watching would be interested. So to be honest, I would say due to language restrictions we can access maybe 10% of the fiction written for the mythos, and we should be thankful to Asamatsu that we even have this to read. The best story I've read of his is called The Queen of Kinyan, which comes alone in the standalone book. What an amazing read. Basically it borrows some core ideas from Lovecraft's own story, The Mound, which he co-wrote with Zalia Bishop, but is otherwise packed with action, a bit of sci-fi, shootouts, villainous characters, references to mythos creations straight from Lovecraft's own stories, and also real-world Asian mythology, and of course, a bizarre mythos monster ready to destroy the world. Humanity really takes it in the arse in this story. It deserves its own video, and I'll make that video next year. The next writer is Chiaki Konaka, sometimes called Chiaki J. Konaka. Konaka is the best example of how Japanese creators of anime and manga would go about borrowing elements from the mythos and insert them into their own original creations which in all good reasoning aren't mythos stories themselves. Konaka states the reasoning for this as being that time constraints are high for anime and manga writers, and that borrowing elements from the mythos saves time from thinking up original ideas every time. It sounds like a case of kids copying the class nerd's homework, I admit, but Konaka is no fake fan of Lovecraft. Apart from his occasional borrowing from the mythos, he has also made some legit contributions too. For example, Konaka made a full-length TV adaptation of The Shadow over Innsmouth. We'll look at that later on in the video. As for his writings, sadly I could only get my hands on one of his stories found in this book. Called Terror Rate, it focuses on a woman who answers a classified ad about a professor looking to research the effect of fear in people and how that may alter the reality around them. I really enjoyed the story, and it reminded me a bit of the mythos tale The Hounds of Tindalos, but also for some reason of the 1997 film Cube, which is a good thing because honestly that film is one of the scariest films I've ever watched. Last but not least is Junji Ito. Junji Ito is one of my favorite writers. His stories are already quite well known in the horror community and has won numerous awards for his works. The top 3 works by him would be Uzumaki, Gyo, and Tomi. All have elements of Lovecraft to varying degrees, but the must-read work for Lovecraftians is Uzumaki. I did a full review of that manga on my channel, so go check that out. Ito has stated many times that he is a fan of Lovecraft, and it definitely shows. While Ito doesn't actually make any direct references to Lovecraft's creations, he does freely admit to Lovecraft's influence on him as a writer. This section of the video was the most difficult to make. If we look in this book, it lists 13 pages of manga that have taken influences from Lovecraft. And to make it even worse, most of these are really hard to find online, at least on English websites. Of course there are the older mangas I mentioned before, like the adaptation of the Dunwich Horror, but I think I'd better focus on modern manga now. So excuse me if this section is a little bit lacking. I'll just show off a few that I found. First off, let's look at the series Jushin Densetsu by Kentaro Yano. It focuses on a human organization called Chaos Seekers who battle against the will of the great old ones of the Mythos. Kind of violates the idea that humanity cannot do anything against the great old ones, but you'll see that notion tends to go out the window in Japan. Yano also created a more comical manga where Cthulhu phones to Thogoe so they can go out, get drunk, and find women. Alcohol and pussy. Not really top of Howard's Christmas wish list, but I get the feeling we shouldn't be too serious in this video. Next is Alicia Y by Juan Goto. The descendants of the Watleys use magic to cause Alicia, the protagonist of the series, to be born into the Armitage family. Enter John Dee, a black magic sorcerer who uses Alicia to wake up Cthulhu so that he can become one with Yog-Sothoth. But Alicia is against this, so tries to stop John Dee, and so the manga is all about this conflict. There's a link where you can view this manga online for free. It's only in Japanese, but it's still fun to look at and to try and spot all the references to the Lovecraft mythos. Next is Jashin Hunter by Uzumi Makoto, which is about a female protagonist's quest to save a friend from the cult of Dagon. Simple premise, sure, but the article where I discovered this manga from lists it as juvenile erotica, and it's about as safe for work as smoking in a fireworks factory. This sort of sexualization of Lovecraft's mythos is a bit more common in Japan than in the West, it seems. Reading through the descriptions of these mangas, I think the biggest thing I noticed is the utter variety. The mythos has been used in manga to focus on action, romance, comedy, pornography, and of course regular horror. It's quite opposed to orthodox mythos depictions, which are typically tightly wrapped around the theme of cosmic horror. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The one anime that comes to mind is Nyaruko Crawling with Love. What a name. This was recommended in many articles I read, and even the title sounded like two Lovecraft stories, Nyarlathotep and The Crawling Chaos. Supposedly this anime doesn't just include a couple references or some random shoggoths in it, but is completely focused on the mythos. This sounds perfect. I mean, sure, the title is weird, but I can appreciate a good anime. I can't wait to see how this one turns out. Howard, what have they done to you? It is the most absurd thing I've seen in a long time. I mean, the juxtaposition here is maddening. Going from the pages of Lovecraft's intense, brooding philosophical horror and world of soul-destroying existentialism filled with hideous, inhuman monstrosities, to this. The story is about a high school boy who is pursued one night by a night gaunt and then saved by Nyarlathotep, who is also a sexy teenage girl. Other starring characters would also be Tsathuka, who is a sexy teenage girl. I'm starting to see a pattern here. And then there's Hasta, who's well, apparently that's a boy. I was actually very amused by this anime, believe it or not. Seeing things we discuss so passionately in the Lovecraft community represented in this light-hearted, parodic, goofy, brightly colored, and at times erotic manner is just... I love the absurdism of it. It just makes me laugh. A second anime I found was called The Mystery of the Necronomicon. Well, this one at least sounds a little bit more serious than that. Crawling with Love. And it's a hentai. Well, shit. Lube up, boys. It's fap time. The story is not as supernatural as you'd expect, and it's more along the lines of a murder mystery, but in a mythos style. So, for example, the murder victims were killed in ritualistic cultist styles. There's also some bizarre dream sequences, and there's some witchcraft. Although it's a hentai and there's lots of sexualized content, it's mostly softcore and nowhere near as graphic as, say, other hentai like Bible Black. There isn't much other anime about Lovecraft, but what you will see quite a bit of is the inclusion of nods and name drops to mythos beings. Let's look at Chiaki Konaka again. The guy regularly slips in numerous references to the mythos in his creations, which otherwise have nothing to do with the mythos. In the anime Armitage 3, well, you only need 3 guesses to see that reference. Konaka was also influential in the popular anime Digimon, with references to Yaggoth, Dagon and Hypnos throughout the anime. There are so many such cases, but you get the point, right? Okay, moving on to the realm of video games, let's see what we can find. Probably the earliest video game using Lovecraft's themes was La Place Normal, released on various consoles back in 1987. If you remember from earlier in this video, this was about the time when Lovecraft really became much more popular with the gamers and manga creators. The story is set in early 20th century New England and is all about humans fighting against blasphemous nightmares, which already checks quite a few boxes in the Mythos guidebook, right? It's done in a survival horror meets Japanese JRPG style, and as a game it works well. It's not overtly related to the Lovecraft mythos, but no doubt the developers had a copy of The Shadow over Innsmouth and Call of Cthulhu lying around the studio when making this. Next up is Necronomicon for the PC-98 and FM Town system. If you've never heard of these consoles, basically they're Japanese only consoles, and this game is Japanese only. Finding any footage or information on this game was really hard, but it seems to be set in 1920s Arkham and involves the birth of some messed up child. Shades of Dunwich horror, right? The game is very story driven and seems to be a point and click type of game with many adult themes, meaning you will see some hot 2D anime titties every now and then. Visually it looks very retro. The sound and music is also very retro, but if you can appreciate retro game music, you'll like this. The frame around the screen also has an obvious H.R. Geiger feel, which is a good thing because Lovecraft and Geiger go together like beer and more beer. Lastly is a survival horror first-person shooter called Innsmouth no Yokata, meaning the Mansion of Innsmouth, for the Virtual Boy console. In it, you'll play as a detective who enters a mansion in Innsmouth in search of the Necronomicon. Of course, there will be deep ones for you to shoot and places to explore, and the typical survival horror management system you'll see in games like Resident Evil. It's a bit sad that it was made for such a shitty console like the Virtual Boy, and not for the NES or Super NES, because the premise is pretty fitting, even though it's quite simple. And The Shadow of Innsmouth is actually one of the few stories where you could actually justify having a first-person shooter, since deep ones technically can be killed through violence. If anime and manga is not for you, then there are at least some real-life options. I really had to dig through the corners of the internet to find much in the way of adaptations though. I found only two. The first is called H.P. Lovecraft's Dunwich Horror and Other Stories, and is an adaptation of 3 of his stories done with claymation and puppets. The stories are The Picture in the House, The Festival, and The Dunwich Horror. Sadly, as is the case with a lot of the stuff I present to you, it's in Japanese only and without subtitles. But the adaptations seem accurate enough, and since we all know Lovecraft's stories inside and out, it's not like you're not going to understand the plot or who the characters are. The animation is extremely minimal, but the music and atmosphere is excellent. This is the type of project of a devoted fan somewhere in Japan who didn't have the money of a big studio to bring to life his fantasy, but the style of the puppets and the clay models is quite unique and eerie. I really like this project because it made me think of a part of the Call of Cthulhu when artists and psychically sensitive people had nightmarish visions when Cthulhu temporarily awoke. So it's like this filmmaker in Japan was one of these people that was in the story. According to the IMDb page, he has made only this project, nothing before and nothing since. Eerie. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube, and I'll put the link in this video's description. The other live adaptation I found is of the Innsmouth story. Again, it's Japanese only and without subtitles. This is more of a problem in this case because the adaptation does not stick strictly to the plot we know of. I found an article on the internet written by someone who breaks down the plot and explains what's going on. The story is interesting and unique enough that I regret not being able to understand Japanese. And who is responsible for this film? Chiaki Konaka. The next films I'm going to talk about are not adaptations in any way, but in my opinion are definitely Lovecraftian enough. First up is Marebito, a classic in the J-horror film genre. Basically, the story goes that there's this outsider type of guy called Masuoka who carries around a camera, and one day he sees this guy commit suicide by stabbing a knife into his own eye. Masuoka wonders, what the hell could the man have seen that's so bad? His investigations lead him into a dark, nightmarish world. For me, this concept alone fascinated me. It's a good question, isn't it? What could be so terrible that you want to stab your eyes out? What could he have seen? This of course is a common plot element in any Lovecraft tale. seeing something so terrifying, so existentially mind-destroying that death is the logical solution. It's really a great film and one of my favorite J-horror films. It was directed by Takashi Shimizu, the biggest name in J-horror cinema. But I wonder who wrote the story. Surprise, surprise, Chiaki Konaka. Finally, there is my third favorite film of all time, Cairo, also known as Pulse in English. The plot goes that there are some mysterious disappearances and sudden suicides occurring around Japan. It later seems that ghosts are coming back from the dead, seeking to steal the lives of those who are still alive. The film is supposed to be about the isolating effect of the internet on people, turning them into shut-ins and so on. No doubt that's an accurate theme of the film, but to me it works as a Lovecraftian horror because of the atmosphere, the utter sense of hopelessness and dread about humanity and the world around you, and the ending which promises nothing to humanity. Those who see the ghosts lose their mind and either just disappear or kill themselves as a result. I couldn't find any evidence that the director and writer Kiyoshi Kurosawa is a Lovecraft fan in any way, nor does the film have anything at all to do with the mythos, but I'll be damned if watching it doesn't fill me with the exact same cosmic dread I feel when I read a good mythos story. There is an American adaptation of this film, but if you watch that film, I will personally find you and bitch slap you. At this point, I should also mention that there is a live adaptation of Uzumaki, the manga I mentioned previously. Personally, I preferred the manga over this film, but if you want to watch the live action film, it's there. And finally, what was Lovecraft's own personal view of Japan and the Japanese? Well, defying the image certain leftist agitators and fake news websites would have you believe about him, Lovecraft actually really respected Japan and its people. According to Lovecraft scholar Daryl Schweitzer, Lovecraft showed a considerable respect for Asian, especially Japanese art and culture, and was enthusiastic about many Japanese traditional art forms such as haiku and artistic prints. He recognized the civilization of Japan to being equal to his own, just different. And if I may quote Lovecraft's own words from a 1933 letter, the combination of utter simplicity, perfect harmony and civilized repose is quite irresistible, and forms something which could never be duplicated outside of Japan. The Japanese carry the spirit of art into the smallest details of life, more fully than any people since the Greeks, and it will be an irreparable loss if their newer generations lose the old spirit in an effort to assimilate Western traditions. I must say, I'm really glad but not at all surprised that Lovecraft had the sensitivity and intelligence to respect this culture and people like he did. Although Japan certainly is quite different in many respects to the West, it doesn't make it a lesser society at all. In conclusion, how would I describe Japan's view of Lovecraft? I think he was quickly recognized by those few writers and artists who came into contact with him for his originality and innovation of the horror genre. Later on, starting around the 90s, he became more known, but if you look at all the Japanese mythos stuff, it seems Lovecraft was mostly cherry-picked and used for purposes other than that of cosmic horror, namely in manga, gaming, and anime. These creators see a particular monster or read a weird name like Yog-Sothoth and think, wow, that's cool and original, and then they insert those, whatever they find, into whatever artistic endeavor they're aiming for, be it a comedy or a cutesy anime or whatever. But those who were faithful to what Lovecraft was all about, people like Ken Asamatsu and the many other writers I didn't have time to mention in name, really created beautiful, different, and valid contributions to the mythos. They understood and related to Lovecraft, and it would be a shame if their writings went overlooked due to the walls erected by obscurity and language. So, is it right to be irritated by these creators who use the mythos for purposes other than cosmic horror? If you know me from my previous videos, I typically don't like it when various media is passed off as Lovecraftian when it lacks things vital such as an element of cosmic horror. But it seems these Japanese creators just like the more colorful aspects or aesthetics we commonly see from companies like Chaosium and Fantasy Flight. A lot of these interpretations are also in good nature or even cute or amusing, so it's hard for me to get annoyed by it. Also, my general love of Japan dampens my usual cynicism. The intent of the artist behind Nyaruko Crawling with Love, for example, wasn't really to make a Lovecraftian horror anime, so to judge it using the Call of Cthulhu as a measuring stick is a bit unfair. To give an example outside of Lovecraft, look at the metal band from Japan called Baby Metal. Instrumentally, the music is heavy as fuck and could be made by any European or American metal band. But the singers are these 3 cute teenage Japanese girls dancing around in a cutesy J-pop style, and the music occasionally includes Japanese instruments and Japanese melodies. Being a metalhead myself, I know that some metalheads think that the band is bullshit, but in my opinion that fusion of the two worlds works quite well. The unusual inclusion of the Japanese elements and the frankly beautiful voice of the lead singer blends to make its own type of metal. Baby metal never intended to be the next Behemoth, Amon Amarth or Rammstein. I hope that makes sense. So, that's my video on the subject. I left out some examples, but if I included every single adaptation and reference to Lovecraft in Japan, it would be just way too long. This video was probably the one which required the most amount of research in order to create, because from the start I knew nothing about it. I had to read a ton of articles, interviews and such things, but it was all worth those hours because of the cool things I found. I mean, it's way easier for us in the West to find Western mythos, but now that this video exists, I hope I can bring to light the stuff Lovecraftians would have otherwise not known about. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it, and sayonara!